Hey, fourth grade, it's Miss Buck. So, Mr. Polanco read chapters 8 and 9 with you guys, and I'm going to be reading chapters 10 and 11. Remember, just like Mr. Polanco said, when I pause, that means you pause and you answer the questions either with your family members or you can write it down on a piece of paper. So, again, when I ask a question, you pause and then come back when you're ready. So, Mr. Polanco left on chapter 9. When he ended his chapter, Ellen met a guy named Mr. Murdoch. Mr. Murdoch was a little suspicious of Ellen and was asking about her bread. That made Ellen pretty nervous. We're going to pick up on chapter 10, and when we're thinking about our chapter and our characters, I also want you to think about the theme. We're going to look at the repeating ideas of things coming up while we read. Let's get started. Hold back the night. Hold back the night, Ellen said over and over as they rode along. She watched the trees stand black against the dull red sunset. Slowly, the sky faded into gray and then turned into night. She thought anxiously of Mr. Shannon's corridor and wondered how long he would wait. Was he watching the few stars that came out in the wintry sky? It must be a long, long ride from Elizabeth to Pennsylvania. If the general was to have the message tomorrow, the first courier would have to start soon. Grandfather would have been there long ago had he come. He had grown very dark when Mr. Murdoch turned his head to her and spoke over his shoulder. It's black as pitch. You better sleep in the loft with my boys tonight. Oh no, cried Ellen. I couldn't do that. How you gonna get to Elizabeth? Ellen took a long breath. Walk, she said in a low voice. Then she remembered the coins in her pocket. Mr. Murdoch, she said, I can pay you to ride me to Elizabeth. Well, the farmer thought it over, but he said no more after that. I have the money, Ellen urged him. I'll give it all to you, everything I have. Well, would he ever make up his mind? Ellen thought. You said it's only half a mile, she reminded him. We'll we'll see what Ma says first. I have to feed my two cows in the woods, and they'll be bellowing to be milked. Then have to round up my pigs and tie them up. And then we can start? Then we can go? Asked Ellen. Well, Ma will be mighty mad if we don't sit down for supper. Ma always gets mad easily, especially if we don't sit down and eat what she cooked. But I reckon I can take you when I get through with all of that. Perhaps Ellen thought she'd be better off just going by herself. Maybe it would even be faster. After all the trouble she had today, it would be terrible if she missed the courier. But when she heard the lonesome howl of an animal far away, she changed her mind. Surely the courier would start this early. It won't be so late, she kept assuring herself. She could smell the wood smoke from the chimney before she saw the shadowy house near the road. It was too, no, it was close, with no light showing from the windows. It's pitch black, she thought to herself. Well, we're here, said Mr. Morak as he turned through the gate. He tied the horse to a ring on the wall. Open up, I'm home again, he shouted. The door flung wide open and two boys ran out. In the dim light, Ellen could see a big black pig tied by his hind legs to a stake just outside the door. Oh, Pa, the boys shouted as they gathered their baskets. We found this mean old pig in the woods and tied him up. Good, said the farmer. We'll turn him into pork tomorrow. A tall, lanky woman came out the door and held it open for them. Her eyes were angry, and her face, beneath a ruffled white cap, looked as it was hacked out of gray stone. She bounced a carrying baby on her hip and slapped at a toddler tugging at her skirt. You're back at last, she snapped. And then, to Ellen's surprise, she burst into tears. Thank the Lord for that, she said as she roughly brushed her tears away with the back of her hand. Ellen followed Mr. Murdoch and the boys into the house. The woman did not seem to see her. She was scolding her husband as she hurried to the fireplace and picked up a big spoon. In times like these, it ain't safe to ride to Amboy to sell leather. If you're dead, I got these four boys to raise by myself. The bootmaker paid me, and we need the money. Mr. Murdoch lifted his yellow beard and took some of the money from the bag that hung from a cord around his neck. Nothing to be worried about, honey. Nothing. Worried, cried his wife in a high voice. With all these red coats around, you ain't worried? She banged her spoon as she stirred the pot of stew that hung over the fire. Her voice became low and firm. Times were better before the war started. That's what I think. Now, Ma, don't talk like that. Mr. Murdoch pushed Ellen forward, but his wife paid her. As she stood waiting for the farmer's wife to notice her, Ellen looked around the log farmhouse. The whole house was just one big shadowy room, lit by fire from one side to the other. Pots and ladles and kettles of iron hung on hooks near the fireplace. In one corner stood a huge spinning wheel, and another corner was a big unmade bed with a trundle bed beneath it and cradle beside it. When she saw that a ladder went straight through the dark hole to the boys' beds in the loft, Ellen was glad she wasn't going to spend the night in that cold, dark place. Mistress Murdoch was still upset. She had the wooden bowls and she had her mugs on the table. I said times were better before the war started. Everything was peaceful, and we farmed our farm, and no soldiers bothered us. She banged the pitcher of milk on the table. I say King George was all right. He didn't bother us none. Why do you want to change things? Mr. Murdoch pushed Ellen forward through the fire. He seemed to want to change the subject fast. I brought home a boy named Tolliver who's mighty hungry. Ellen remembered to snatch off her cap and and stuff it in her pocket before she nodded her head politely, as boys would have done. The farmer's wife looked at her gloomily. Then she looked at the pot of stew and gave it a quick stir. There's enough, she said, if he ain't too hungry. Pa, go outside and hide your horse in the woods. Supper was waiting long enough. With his wooden milk pail in his hand, Mr. Murdoch quickly pulled his cap over his bushy hair, hunched his shoulders, and stomped to the door. Boys, Mistress Murdoch ordered, go help your pa. She pulled a bench to the fire. Sit, she said to Ellen. Ellen hadn't known how hungry she was until she smelled the pot of stew. Meat and onions and turnips. Oh, this was going to be good, she thought. What a wonderful supper for someone who hadn't eaten anything but oatcake since early this morning. She stuffed her mittens in one of her pockets and carefully untied the blue bundle. This bread can dry out here for the fire by the fire while we eat supper. It's my grandfather's loaf of bread, she explained to Mistress Murdoch. It fell in water. The woman looked at it. It's right, you're right. It's pretty soggy, she said. Not too much, I guess. She picked up the wet handkerchief and spread it out to dry by a pyre on the firewood. Your feet are soggy too, she said as she bent down to look at Ellen's shoes. And your breeches? Oh, goodness. You are wet to the skin, she cried, wiping her hands and her apron. Take off those breeches, Tolliver, she ordered. We'll hang them to the fire too. Take off her breeches and risk that woman finding out she was a girl? Ellen started to get alarmed. How could she explain why she was dressed like a boy? Only spies and criminals went around pretending to be someone they're not. Oh no, she cried in dismay. I'm going to Elizabethtown tonight. Elizabeth, the woman stared at her. Tonight? In the dark? And in this kind of weather? You'd freeze to death. But I must go. Mr. Murdoch said he'd ride me there. Ride you to Elizabeth on a night like this? The farmer's wife clapped her hands to her head. What now? Say that again? That man must have lost his wits. She gripped Ellen's shoulder roughly into her strong hands. Take off those breeches, boy. You're chilled to the bone. Are you bashful or something? Ellen drew back. Someone is waiting for me, she began. She tried to think fast. Suddenly, the woman picked her up, tossed her on the bed, and started peeling off the wet breeches. Ellen kicked her legs and tried to squirm away. At that, the woman's face went white with anger. There will be no riding out where there are soldiers tonight, she said with tight lips. If he gets shot, I've got 4 boys to raise on my own, so you can take off those breeches and let them dry. He's not going to Elizabeth, and neither are you. In desperation, Ellen pushed the woman's hands away, grabbing the top of the breeches and kicking her feet. She worked her way to the edge of the bed. Mistress Murdoch stepped back and looked at her. What's wrong with you, Tolliver? She cried. Quickly, Ellen scrambled from the bed and ran to the door. She was glad to find that it wasn't bolted. She flung it open and darted out into the night, pulling her breeches as she ran. Thank goodness she had not taken off her jacket or shoes yet. She flew through the gate and across the road and hid among the trees. It was not until the door swung closed and all was dark around her that she remembered. Oh, the loaf of bread. She had left it by the fire. A wild fright came over her, and she stood shivering in the dark, cold night. What is she going to do now? She couldn't tell Mr. Murdoch. He was suspicious about the bread anyway. And she couldn't go back to the door. That stubborn woman might take away all her clothes and give her a cornmeal sack for a night dress. She was shaking with cold and fear and anger. How could she have forgotten the bread that she guarded so carefully all day? How could she have been so stupid? Then a square of light broke into the darkness, and there stood Mistress Murdoch in the open doorway. Here, pig, the woman said as she flung Ellen's loaf to the pig. Turn that soggy old bread into pork, then slammed the door shut, and then it was dark again. Ellen could hear the pig grunt and snuffle around. When he found the bread, he would gulp it quickly, and in his greediness, he would probably swallow the snuff box too. Ellen was afraid of pigs. She always walked clear of those lean, hungry public pigs who wandered about the New York streets and ate the garbage. She remembered the mean look on the 2 pigs that chased her this morning. But now there wasn't a second to lose. She had to get the bread. She could feel her kneecaps shaking, and she couldn't make them stop as she raced across the road. If only there were more light from the pale stars overhead. She put her hands to grope the pig's prickly back, and when she felt it, she ran her fingers down and the pig lowered his head. But the thought of his sharp teeth made her snatch her hand away. The smell of him, ugh, the awful smell, also made Ellen start gagging. Again, she reached out her hand. He rumbled through and was moving a lot and shuffling his hips. She ran her hands through his back again, and he snorted angrily. Now her eyes had grown used to the dark, and she could tell that the bread was already in his mouth. She must grab for it, she thought. It was nothing else to do. Quickly, she snatched her cap from her pocket and switched it across her eyes, back and forth across his eyes. The pig tossed his head and snorted in rage. It was a terrifying sound. But when Ellen saw the bread fall from his mouth, she scooped it up quickly and darted out of his way. She was glad he was tied to a stake and couldn't charge her, so he was stuck and Ellen was out of there. Here's a picture of Ellen touching the pig. So I want to stop right there. And here's when, remember, after the question, you pause. How does the author describe Ellen's fear of the pig? What words and actions and thoughts does the author describe Ellen's fear of pigs? Okay, great. I hope you are back. We're going to be moving on. This is the last page, guys. As she raced through the gate and down the road, her feet barely touched the ground. She heard the door open and Mistress Murdoch call out, You all right, Pa? You got the boys there with you? But Ellen didn't turn to look. Mistress Murdoch couldn't see her running down the road, for she was out of sight with the loaf of bread in her trembling arms. She knew grandfather's snuff box was safe inside. She could feel with her fingers that there was only one bite gone, and not a very big bite at that. So the pig got a bite. Since she had since she had no handkerchief to wrap around it, she tucked it up under her jacket where it sat like a lump of ice on her stomach. Hmm. That's the end of chapter 10, and I want us to think about ways to summarize the chapter. So if you do right now, you can pause the video, maybe if you have a paper and pencil, and you can summarize the chapter, only writing down the important events. I have two more questions for this chapter. And remember, when I ask the questions, make sure you pause the video to answer them, to talk to your parents, or write it down. What do you think Ellen learns about herself in this chapter? I want to know how she changes. Great. And then the last question that we have is, how is being private different from keeping secrets? That one I really want you guys to think about. I'm going to repeat that again. How is being private different from keeping secrets? And what is Ellen doing? Is she being private or is she keeping secrets? Okay, that wraps up chapter 10. Remember, in the beginning, when I started reading, we were thinking about theme. So I would like you to think about the theme of this chapter. And that means we're thinking about all the repeating ideas that were read. I'm going to see you guys for chapter 11.